Hello and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show about European affairs. On Brussels, my love, we take a look at some stories that hit the headlines this week. Find out what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us for this edition, brought to you for the very first time from Strasbourg, where members of the European Parliament met to discuss some of the major challenges facing Europe today. Apart from a deal on an EU microchip act, the big story here this week was Fit for 55. Sounds a bit like a Pilates programme, but actually it's the EU playbook for reducing carbon emissions by 55% by the year 2030. MEPs gave the green light to three major parts of the puzzle. From a tax on carbon to a social climate fund, we break it down and hear what it means for us, for the climate and for European industry. And Italy declares a state of emergency in response to an increase of migrants to their country. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 30,000 people have entered Italy illegally this year, mostly from Tunisia, Libya, Turkey. Figures members of the European Parliament have been mulling over this week as they made yet another attempt to approve parts of an EU Commission migration proposal that would mean more burden sharing across the EU. To talk about these stories and much more, we're joined here in the studio by Malin Björk, Swedish MEP from the Left Group. Welcome. Hello. Peter Liese, German MEP from the European People's Party. And also we're joined by Jakob Dalunde, Swedish MEP from the Group of the Greens. Welcome to Euronews.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. First, how has your week been in Strasbourg?
Always full.
Full and busy.
Starting early, ending late.
And for yourself, Mr. Liese, intense, right?
It was very busy, but also a very good week, I think, mainly for the climate and for the people, but also for me as a rapporteur for the emission trading system. After a lot of discussions, we finally have agreed on the text, and that's why I'm also very happy.
A document this size, right? A massive document. And yourself?
Very intense, but it's good to see that years of labour finally bear fruit.
Well, look, before we elaborate on those three climate laws that got over the line this week and were voted upon, let's just remind our viewers why there was such a hurry. Christopher Pitchers reports.
The EU has a dream. Revolutionise the way we live, travel, produce and do business here in Europe. In a nutshell, to be carbon neutral by 2050. Their big policy package, Fit for 55, that focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, was centre stage in Strasbourg this week. Not one, but 3 out of 13 new laws were approved by MEPs in the European Parliament. This included the EU's emissions trading system for aviation and maritime, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and a new social climate fund. The idea to encourage countries outside the EU to boost their climate ambitions and avoid being undermined by companies relocating to countries with less ambitious climate policies. The reforms mean that all those doing business in Europe will have to invest in technologies that decarbonise or face paying a huge price for polluting.
So there you go, Christopher Pitchers reporting, saying that you've got to invest in new tech that reduces emissions or pay a huge price tag for pollution. So let's find out more. We start perhaps with yourself, Mr. Peter Liese, and tell us about these votes. What will they mean and what happens next?
Yeah, I think it's very important. We adopted the biggest climate law ever, and we decided that we build our strategy on a market-based system, which means that the necessary emission reductions, we see all over Europe the effects of climate change already. Forests are dying. We have drought in northern Italy. We have had the flooding in 21 in Central Europe. So we need to act and we need to lead by example for the world. But we need to do it as the lowest possible costs because it's a huge effort. That's why it should always happen where it is most cost efficient. This guarantees the ETS. And what I think it's also the second very important thing. For the first time, we managed that all the revenues that member states and commission will get from this system will be spent on purpose. The member states must do it. They cannot just put it in their pocket and do whatever they want. They need to finance the transition in industry so that we keep the jobs in Europe, but also compensate and help people that are in need. And I think this is also a big revolution of this week.
So all eyes, of course, on the EU member states that have to implement everything and agree, indeed, on what was decided here and what was voted on. What was your take? What was the left's take on those 3 climate laws?
Well, I think, when all of us was elected, our mandate was very, very strong on actually doing everything we can during this legislature for the climate. We promised that to hundreds and thousands and millions of young voters. And in that sense, from the left, we support the deals that were made this week. But we know that they are not enough. And I think that has to be very clear also when we go into, the future and to the coming, European elections in 8 to 10 months. We have to know that we have to do better and we can do even more. So we should celebrate that we have a deal. It is not as strong as the left would have wanted. It socially doesn't have as much of social sustainability linked with the environmental sustainability as we in the left would like.
Okay. So Malin Bjork there at the left saying they don't go far enough. What would you say as a Green member of the European Parliament, Jakob?
Well, on the one hand, I think it's a historic decision. We're finally making sure that aviation and shipping pays for its fair share and starts its transition to more sustainable technology and also shifts traffic away from aviation and shipping to more sustainable modes of transportation, such as the railways. However, it's not all good. We still have in this package giant subsidies to the worst polluters in the industry. We are still keeping them past 2030. And as Greens, this deal is as far as we could pull the other more conservative parties. But of course, we would have liked to go further. And instead of subsidizing polluting industry, subsidizing people in the green transition.
Well, look, isn't it always about compromise politics, right? That's what you've been up to for the last few years, of course, negotiating on this text. Let's just put up on screen there a little graph to show our viewers who might not be as familiar as our MEPs with what exactly was voted upon this week. First, it was the reform of the ETS, the emissions trading system, as Jakob said there, including aviation and, of course, maritime, and also a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM for short, which is essentially a carbon tax, and also a social climate fund worth up to 86.7 billion euros. Sounds like a lot of money. How will this fund work? Peter Liese?
The Climate Social Fund is part of the revenues that we create with the new system. The ETS will be extended and there will be a separate system for road transport and for buildings. And 86 billion euros will go in that fund. But what I also find very important, the rest of the money that comes to the member states' pockets, it's twice as much, about 160 billion, must also be spent on purpose and take social aspects into account. So it's not, when people say 80 billion may not be enough, it's 3 times as much. And when we monitor the member states and push them to really live up to their obligation, then we can really make everybody able to do this transition. We had a fight, the left and the Greens were more ambitious when it comes to industry, but less ambitious when it comes to this heating and road transport part of the ETS. But I'm convinced everybody needs to contribute, and everybody that is not able to do it needs to be supported. So it's not an alternative to tell poor people, you can keep your fossil fuel for the next 20 years. The fossil fuels will always be more expensive. The alternative is to help them. And that's what we are doing here. That is, I think, a very important step.
And they need help now, of course, because poor people are getting poorer here in the European Union. They've been getting poorer with energy prices rising since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This fund has been created specifically for vulnerable families. But how would you define a vulnerable family, and how do you make sure that they get hands on this money?
Well, luckily, those decisions are not up to me, but rather to the member states. We are providing funding that will then member states will have to decide how to best support the most vulnerable citizens. And that can, of course, vary all throughout Europe. So that, I think, is quite
Malin Bjork, do you trust the EU member states?
No, this is part of the problem. As in the left, we are green, parties, but we are also red. In red, I would say, we emphasize we need a just transition, or there will be no transition. There is not a natural law that says that poorer people should become poorer, and especially now, we could invest in climate transition for everyone. And you invest in people, the welfare state, education, healthcare, and in climate, adaptation. So we have to do that at the same time. And the Social Climate Fund, it will help member states, but it does not help enough in terms of providing the solutions for a just transition. So a lot of responsibility will rest on the member states themselves.
If I may, first of all, it's not only the fund, it's 3 times as much money. And the second point is, member states didn't do well in the past. We have an ETS already, and also the poor have to pay their bit when the electricity price goes up because the CO2 price goes up. That's also a social problem. It was never addressed, and even though the Greens and the left always said it should be a high price, but the member states have not done well. Italy spent 30% of the money on purpose. Until now, Poland 50%. Others like Sweden and Germany did better, but the social component was not addressed. In Germany, relatively rich people get more from this money because they install the heat pump, they buy an electrical car, and the relatively poor people didn't. So that's why my proposal is the support for a poor family that buys a heat pump must be higher than the support for a rich family that buys a heat pump, the social component. And it's mandatory in our legislation. They have to spend this money respecting social challenges. And I think this is also, you are right, they have some flexibility, but they have the obligation to respect this principle.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I actually agree. Where we, I think, disagree is how much of the money do we spend in subsidizing the industry with free allowances. I would have preferred, if I can make, I support this deal, but if I could have made changes, I would remove subsidies to polluting industry and increase the Social Climate Fund and help poorer people, vulnerable households, to make the green transition easier.
But industry are obviously trying to digest this massive change and all these laws coming out as well of Strasbourg this week that were voted upon. And we wanted to hear the perspective. So our Grégoire Laurie over in Brussels spoke to Adolfo Aiello, the Deputy Director for Climate and Energy from the European Steel Association. Take a listen.
Our sector in the next 8 years is expected to invest around 30 billion euros to decarbonize. But at the same time, it needs to remain competitive. So, for instance, we have 45 billion euros of European steel that are exporting to third countries. And these exports, with the current measures, would be fully exposed to unilateral cost and would be made uncompetitive. So, in short term, our survival is at stake, and our transition to a green steel is also at stake.
Adolfo Aiello there, the Deputy Director for Climate and Energy for the European Steel Association, saying that his short-term survival, Malin Bjork, is at stake. What would you say to him?
Well, I think there even in the industry, there are lots of innovation going on, and especially in Sweden, there is the innovation project to produce steel with hydrogen instead. So there is lots of possibilities. And also with this carbon border mechanism or carbon border tax, parts of this industry will be compensated by the fact that imports will be made more expensive. Let's say they will have to pay a carbon tax if they're not taxed or they don't have an ETS that they have to contribute to in their country. So that will be a better leverage field for them. So I think that we cannot also say that we will not embark on a green transition because, we have to keep business as usual. We have to then support, as was said here, invest in innovation, in the transition of the industry. That is the future. We know it's the future. We know it's the future for Europe, and we can be a leader and show how it's going to be done elsewhere. It's obvious.
And Peter Lees, I imagine you've been in talks with industry for the last couple of years as well. What's your take?
I did a lot, and I think there is a serious issue, because if we increase the burden for industry in Europe too much, we will have the problem that some of the plants will really have to close, and then we have unemployed people. That's also a social issue. That's why I don't buy this that free allowances are bad and helping people is good. Free allowances are also there to protect jobs. But, and here I disagree with the speaker from the industry, we did a lot. We changed the Commission proposal. We give them for a limited time free allowances, and those that start to invest now will have the possibility to survive and at the same time decarbonize. So the CEO of the biggest steel plant in Europe, which I had a lot of contact during the negotiation, said it's a good compromise, and I hope the rest of the industry will also understand that. We wanted to protect jobs. It was very important for me and my Christian Democratic political group, and I think we succeeded. And if the CEO of the biggest steel plant says it's a good compromise, it should be a good compromise.
Is it a good compromise, Jakob?
I think it's a good compromise, but I still, to some extent, feel that it's sad that we have to sit here in 2023 and be happy with this compromise. In my opinion, this is things we should have done decades ago.
I'm sure that the Friday for Future protesters would agree with you thoroughly. They've been watching as well, looking for answers from the Parliament. But I guess it's all about finding a balance, right? Because some people, they're trying to make ends meet. They're trying to reach the end of the month, and others, they're trying to save the planet. And there's also the threat of a yellow vest movement as well, like we've seen in France a couple of years ago. How do you strike that balance when you're negotiating on these crucial climate files? Madam Björk?
Well, I think that's maybe one of the major criticisms from the left, that we don't sufficiently connect the kind of policies for justice and the policies for green transition. And I don't think there will be a transition where people go along with the necessary steps if we don't make society more equal at the same time. And you cannot say, with the wealth and the richness that is created in our societies, that we couldn't have the chance to invest in education and health, because these are the two things, and housing. And as long as we are not ready to make that political project very clear, we will see the yellow vest, we will see the demonstrations. The gaps are increasing between people and inequalities. And it's not because of climate policies, but the climate policies are not part of the solution, and they could be. So we will continue to have both an equality perspective and a green perspective. And I think this is what the future needs. And I think that's what the younger generation would like to see also.
And this week in Strasbourg, that conversation has started on who will pay for this transition, because, of course, that's the kind of uncomfortable conversation that has to take place now at a local level, at national level, and, of course, at European level. Yeah.
So we have 700 billion euros revenues, and they should be spent on purpose. That's the first point. And, of course, the social question needs to be addressed. But to say we don't want a CO2 price, which some colleagues said, and that's also the reason why, for example, the majority of the left and the French Greens voted against, they say this will harm the poor. But if we don't address the rich, we also don't have these revenues. To say we don't do it would also get the people out of their responsibilities. They have big houses, big cars, big ships. They should pay, and then we should help those that are not able to do the transition on their own. And I don't think we can say industry must do it and everybody else is free. We all have a responsibility. Everybody should do what he can, and those that cannot should be supported. And one word on the yellow vest. I think the big mistake of Macron was not to say we need a carbon price, and that's part of the solution, but at the same time to reduce taxes for the rich, to have no social fund, and to think that will fly. That was a big mistake. So it was an isolated measure, and that's why it created such an uproar. We don't do these isolated measures here.
No isolated measures here in the European Parliament, Strasbourg. Very briefly, last word to yourself, Jakob.
I think it's important to remember that climate policy is inherently just, because it's the rich people who pollute the most. They fly the most, they consume the most, and poor people will be hit the hardest by climate change if we don't act.
OK, thank you so much, Jakob, and thank you to you both as well. That is, I'm afraid, all we have time for on this topic. But do stay with us, because after the break, we'll be telling you why Italy has declared a state of emergency due to the increase in migrants. See you soon here on Euronews and euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show that picks apart some of the stories that impact Europe. Well, as well as climate change, another major story that was up for discussion this week here in Strasbourg was migration and the never-ending, ongoing talks among EU countries to find a common approach. To address the situation in her country, the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has declared a state of emergency, which means the government can essentially make decisions at speed. To find out more, I spoke to the Italian MEP, Carlo Fidanza, from Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party. Take a listen.
We had an increase of 300% of migrant flows towards Italy. This caused a congestion of an overcrowding of the reception centers, and this led the government to choose the way of this state of emergency in order to facilitate the procedures, the bureaucratic procedures, administrative procedures, to build or install new facilities in all the national territory.
Italian MEP Carlo Fidanza, they were speaking to me a little bit earlier, so I'd like to hear your reaction to that declaration of a state of emergency. Is it really emergency? And Madam Björk, we start with you.
No, I think it's appalling that we have a member state that declares a state of emergency. It's a far-right government also that has declared that it doesn't want, it wants to close Europe's borders, basically. And of course, that is not a possibility. We are bound by the Geneva Convention. People have to have the right to come irregularly, even. Not illegally, irregularly, I mean, it's called, to Europe to seek asylum and protection. And we have seen in the European Union that we can provide protection for people seeking refuge. We have seen it with the Ukrainian refugees. And, they have to be able to leave and find protection in Europe away from Putin's brutal war. And, instead of looking at what we are doing things well here, and we are sharing the responsibility and we can do better, and take that model. Now we're hearing different far-right proposals gaining ground, and they basically just want to close.
We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just hear as well from Jakob. Do you also find it appalling, this declaration of a state of emergency?
I do. Seeking asylum is a human right. It's not a human right to be granted asylum, but to seek asylum. That's a human right. And I find it appalling that Italy is acting in this way to deny vulnerable people their right to seek asylum.
We've seen as well a lot of protesters on the streets of Rome earlier this week criticising the government's crackdown on migrants. But at the same time, Giorgia Meloni's party is supported, and a lot of people as well are in favour of this move. Peter Lisa, what would you say?
I don't have a lot of sympathy to Mrs. Meloni's party, but I see the problem. So our former president in Germany, Joachim Gauck, said, our heart is big, but our means are limited. And I would like to help a lot of people. I worked in Guatemala as a doctor, so I have a lot of empathy with people outside of Europe. But I understand when I talk to mayors in my country, in Germany, that they are at their limits. So we have a challenge here. And it's right, seeking asylum is a human right. But can't we do it better so that people that in the end will not be granted asylum are a bit more, focused, and that we don't have so many people that come to Europe that shouldn't get asylum, and that it's a bit more clear in the beginning. So I see the problem, my mayors tell it, and we need to find a better solution.
We heard this week in Strasbourg MEPs saying that we're sleepwalking towards a migration crisis because each member state will essentially go their own way. It looks like finding a European solution, finding a proper migration asylum pact that works, i.e. the proposal as well that was put on the table from the Commission, it's just not possible, Jakob. I mean, your countries as well, Sweden and Germany, you have a responsibility too, but there doesn't seem to be political will.
I think it's important to remember that this crisis is really a crisis of politics and of empathy. In terms of migration, it is actually manageable. It's not the entire world who wants to come to Europe. It's roughly 1 million people who want to go to Europe to seek asylum. And while that might sound like enough, this is a continent of 500 million. If you have a village of 500 people and one person come knocking on the door and say, this village of 500 people, do you have room for me? Of course we would.
But Peter Liese says his mayors do not have room at the inn anymore.
That's because we don't divide the responsibility all across Europe. If we would do that, it would work.
And the idea of mandatory division, i.e. mandatory quotas, is absolutely off the table. It's just toxic when it comes to member states.
Because, I've been working with this since last legislature, and we've had proposals on the table that are built on this, that we share the responsibility. And that is the way forward, of course. It's dignified reception condition, sharing the responsibility, doing it in a way that is proper and legally secure for the ones seeking asylum. I mean, my vision of Europe is that we can definitely do that. And if we cannot do that, and if we cannot step up when it comes to saving lives in the Mediterranean, it's horrifically deadly in the Mediterranean since, a decade. And I think if we cannot do that, then we are failing. That's not the kind of Europe that I want to see, that we in the left want to build. And I see what is happening with Ukraine. It is a horrific war, but it has showed us when solidarity needs to be there, we can do it. So let's learn from that and take steps towards that instead of this, far-right proposals of closing the borders, building closed center, almost like jails. I have been there. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've talked to people. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And
fences, of course, another conversation being had here in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. They're no longer taboo. The debate now is over whether or not the European Commission should fund them. Peter Liese, what's your take?
Yeah, first of all, Jakob, if it is only 1 million people and we would divide it, it would be possible. But of course, we tried. In the last Parliament, we did emergency votes, extra sessions to vote on a legal proposal. But unfortunately, it's not possible to implement. I really regret this, but when my mayors come to see me and say, we need a solution, I cannot say I voted in 2015 for the redistribution of refugees. So there is a challenge, and it may also be much more people that would like to come to Europe if the borders are completely open. So that has to be taken into account. My group voted in the budget decision for the Council compromise, so that also border measures can be financed by the European Union. And I think that is not the only part of the solution, but it is part of the solution.
OK, Peter Liese, I'm afraid we've run out of time on that topic that we will definitely revisit very soon and keep you all informed on what is decided. Thank you so much to our panel, and thank you for watching. We'll see you soon here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show about the week that was. Well, this week we're broadcasting from Strasbourg, where members of the European Parliament met and discussed, among other things, the detention of the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was arrested while reporting last month in Russia. The 31-year-old American, whose family left the Soviet Union back in the 70s, stands accused of spying and is behind bars for weeks. The European Parliament is indignant. Take a listen.
Let me reiterate our call for his safe release and underline the European Parliament's commitment to seeing him free as quickly as possible. Journalists must be able to do their job without fearing for their lives or their freedom, and this is a line that should not have been crossed.
Roberta Metsola there, the President of the European Parliament, saying that a line that should not have been crossed there. Apart from words, Jakob, what more can the European Parliament do?
I think it's just appalling in the way that Russia not only treats its neighbors, invading Ukraine, but also jailing journalists, putting down protests. It's really going down the drain as a country.
Malin?
Well, I think the Russian regime and Putin's regime has, since many years, persecuted people at home, LGBTI activists, women's rights activists, journalists, and we know that this authoritarian state is extremely dangerous for people living there. And now they're also, jailing foreign journalists. So the level is increasing. But I think we should not be surprised. I mean, Russia has brutally invaded Ukraine and is already, we know, guilty of war crimes. So this is maybe to be expected that they step up their oppression also to foreign citizens. But I think we have to use more of sanctions. I am very happy that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is going after Putin. I think things like this helps. So we have to look into all these instruments.
Peter-Lisa, the Kremlin says that Evan was carrying out espionage under the cover of journalism. His family and journalists all around the world say that he was just doing his job, that he's a great reporter. What's your take?
Of course, he's a journalist and journalists should be protected. But I agree that's just another sign that what kind of regime we have in Russia with Putin. And that's why it's so important. This war in the Ukraine is not a war only against the Ukraine. It's a war against our values, freedom of speech, democracy. Putin hates democracy, hates freedom. And that's why we have to support the Ukraine, I think also with weapons, but also with other means. I feel ashamed that we still have energy and other parts from Europe. For some nuclear plants in Europe, we get Russian equipment still, oil in an indirect way. So I was, after the outbreak of the war, on the Monday, I said we should stop all the energy to not finance this war, because it's not only the Ukraine, it's our values that are attacked.
Malin, do you feel like support for Ukraine is dwindling?
The energy issue is very important in terms of like where is Putin getting his funding from, and we have been trying from our political side to ask for shutting down the dependency on Russian fossil fuels, but also all kinds of Russian imports. But I think it has proven difficult. I think the sanctions and also against specific strategic people in Russia has to be there, and also to support. If we look at Russia, support, although how difficult that might be, all the actors that actually work for democracy and human rights.
I have to stop you there just to hear a final, very brief word from Jakob.
I think it's important that we realize that we are still funding this regime. We're still funding this war, and this should stop now.
Jakob Dunder, Swedish Green MEP, Malin Björk and Peter-Lisa, thank you so much for being with us here for our first edition from Strasbourg. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you very soon here on Euronews and, of course, euronews.com.